All right, Ryan Selkis of Messari, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for coming and being one of our media partners. It's been a great event so far.
It's been great. We're here in our Decrypting Mainnet booth. I mean, let's talk about the conference. It feels like with everything that's gone on in the last year and a half, and that's not just the pandemic, but everything with the rise of crypto in the market, this feels a little bit like a kind of coming out moment these 3 days. I mean, what's your take on how the conference has felt so far?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think last year, everything kind of hit at the same time across all verticals within crypto. We had the macro backdrop that led the Bitcoin rally. We had the emergence of Ethereum as a platform facilitating hundreds of actual useful applications and second layer networks. That created congestion issues. There was a booming market earlier this year for other interoperable blockchains and other layer one systems. We had the birth of DeFi last year. We had the explosion of NFTs. We've, across the board, just the amount of technical progress, market progress, user adoption in the last couple of years has been staggering, and we've somewhat lost sight of it and the physical footprint of it because we haven't physically been together for 2 years. I think the last time many folks were together was probably around DevCon in Osaka way back in the fall of 2019.
And you threw the first consensus conference, right? That was 2015, 2016?
Technically not the first one, 2016 and 2017. So that was the first multi-day consensus, and it was actually hosted right here as well. So to a certain extent, this is kind of a comeback story, and the old CoinDesk events team is now on Team Messari, and that's why this has been such a good event so far.
So what's changed, what hasn't changed from back then?
Well, I think the first couple of consensus conferences, you got to remember, really were around the birth of Ethereum. I mean, Ethereum went live in 2015, and so our first conference was less than a year after the mainnet launch of Ethereum. It was actually right after the DAO, which caused quite a cratering. And back then, we were thinking about enterprise adoption of Bitcoin and how would Bitcoin ultimately integrate itself into the rest of the financial system. And so you saw back then a lot of enterprise blockchain projects.
Blockchain, not Bitcoin.
Blockchain, not Bitcoin. Yep. that have since gone nowhere. And then 2017 actually was right around the beginning of the ICO euphoria, and it was the kind of the early interesting ICOs that were the precursor to the much larger bubble later that year. And so that was, I think, maybe a similar energy. The difference this time around is that it's not all price led. There's a lot of folks here that have been in the trenches building. A lot of them have done fabulously well financially and as entrepreneurs. But the conversations, if you mill the halls, are really about the products that are getting built and a lot of kind of partnerships, discussions as you kind of mill about.
And a follow-up in terms of how it all feels. I mean, let's talk a little bit about the politics of crypto. I was in Miami for the Bitcoin conference in June. That was very much a Bitcoin-only conference. I mean, by design. It was like, we believe there's only one God, and that God is Bitcoin. And now you get into DeFi and Ethereum, and people throw around the term Bitcoin maximalists, ETH maxis. Right now here at Mainnet, it does not feel to me that way. It does not feel to me like there are people here who are, there is only one chain and everything else is trash. I mean, where do you see that headed, and do you think that people who do see crypto that way, is that being kind of phased out?
Well, I actually would say that personally, this does feel a lot like the Bitcoin Miami conference, except it feels like all the VIP events after hours, because that's kind of the folks that are in town now, and that's not to knock what they did down in Miami a few months ago. And I myself am, a big Bitcoin proponent, as you know. So, but I do think it's important to recognize that this is an asset class now. And this is a large ecosystem of emerging technologies where Bitcoin is almost in a class of its own. I've always compared Bitcoin, it's asset-centric, powered by tech. The rest of this ecosystem is tech-centric, powered by assets, and kind of secured by the assets that underpin these digital ledgers.
Speaking of secured by and assets, how many of these assets are you seeing? I'm going, what do you think of Gensler's speech, and how much of a threat does the industry face?
The speech from just an hour ago? I only saw the cliff notes of it. I did not actually tune in because I've been running around all day, but I just did get briefed on the notes from a few minutes ago. And look, it's not inconsistent with what he said. I think generally speaking, he's been forcefully reiterating that most tokens, in his view, are securities. He has been very vocal in basically supporting the Elizabeth Warren line of attack, which is this is the Wild West, and it won't survive unless teams come into compliance. And I think it's unfortunate. And unfortunately, there's both from the SEC's perspective, I think from the American perspective, and then obviously from industry, it's we're kind of between a rock and a hard place, because you can't start a conversation with the SEC when that is their default mode. It's a complete non-starter to expect that some of these decentralized networks are going to come into compliance with public reporting requirements in the US. And then by extension, it makes it impossible for the exchanges to do business. And what that's ultimately going to do is it's going to push more of the activity, more of the market structure overseas and onto decentralized platforms, which is not net bad, but it's certainly net bad from a usability standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, because you'd rather have that activity on centralized, regulated US exchanges, but with common sense regulations that are coming down from on high. And I don't think anyone in the industry has pushed back on that. I think their approach is very aggressive, and it's technically short-sighted, certainly economically short-sighted, because you're talking about the highest growth area of American tech this year.
So for what you guys do, I mean, the next question would be, what does all this mean for investors? People who've come around to investing in digital assets, how concerned should they be when they see headlines about Gary Gensler thinks that most tokens are securities and need to be regulated as such?
Well, I think this plays out over a very long period of time. If you think about how many years many of these projects have been engaging with the SEC, and how long it will take for certain cases, to the extent that it goes to litigation, how long it will take to work itself through the courts. You're talking about years still until we have some clarity. That's not to say that there couldn't be a slew of enforcement actions, there couldn't be a bunch of negative press, and of course that's always going to feed into investor sentiment. But I think from a policy standpoint, from a legal standpoint, projects within the industry do have some pretty solid legs to stand on in terms of defending themselves from overreach from some of the more active regulators. The SEC, being maybe first and foremost right now when you're talking about the broad universe of tokens, but certainly not the only ones that we're concerned with some of the hardline regulatory stances.
Just yesterday, supposedly, the conference got a lot of attention because supposedly someone was served a legal notice by the SEC on site. Did you see all the buzz about that? Do you know who it was? Any thoughts on what happened?
I saw the buzz about it. I did not see it happen. Haven't been able to confirm it. Maybe you all have with your sleuthing, but
working on it.
Yeah,
we have some reporters on that. Yeah, stay tuned.
I have not seen that, or I'm not able to confirm it. At the end of the day, I would not be surprised. There's precedent for it, but it's unfortunate that you're. That's the environment that we're in, where we have invited congressional staffers and regulators to this event. We would have comped many of their passes, and they choose to hide by the escalators instead of learning about what's actually going on in the industry. So you can lead a horse to water, but...
Interesting. I do want to ask, though, I try to stay impartial, but I share your frustration because I used to be a regulator and former lawyer at the SEC's kind of inaction. I was like, please give us rules, and they just won't, and they won't. And some will say, that's Congress's job, but Congress seems dysfunctional too. And I've been watching your Twitter feed lately, a lot of politics in there. Half the time I think you're just letting off steam, but sometimes I think you're serious. So what would a kind of coherent, cohesive American politics look like in your view?
Well, it's a little bit of both. It is serious but not literal, I guess would be the way to think about it. And I think U.S. exchanges and infrastructure companies are already regulated, number one. And so when you think about the two major policy areas that need to be solved and we really need clarity on in the near term, it's in tax reporting and what role these exchanges and centralized third parties that are facilitating transactions, what role they have in helping their customers with tax reporting. Because it's a nightmare. I don't know how frequently you both transact. I know that my tax reporting is a nightmare every year, and I'm actually dissuaded from transacting in and experimenting with some of these technologies because it's so cumbersome and because the penalties are so severe. if you get anything wrong without all this clarity.
Well,
right?
and of course, there are people just not disclosing this stuff on the taxes, thinking that it's not sophisticated enough yet that I'll be kind of hunted down. You know, like it was only a few years back that the IRS started explicitly saying disclose your crypto-related gains as capital gains. But
well, you know, I think that's an overblown concern. You know, I look around at all the funded unicorn even tax compliance startups. TaxBit is $1 billion company backed by some of the largest investors in space. There's a number of others that are in that same vein. And you don't get to $1 billion valuation if people aren't paying their taxes. People are paying TaxBit to do a better job of automating and completing their tax filing. So I think that's a little bit overblown. And if you have clarity on what the tax policy is, and it's very black and white, and you had something like a task force or a group that was actually responsible for rulemaking and doing the hard work of keeping this up to date so that you could make it easier for people to calculate correctly. I think that's one thing. And also, again, the 1 and 1A there is we need clarity on what the policies are, and then 1A is we need clarity on what the centralized infrastructure provider's role in that is. Now, the second thing, just to be very specific, we'll go back to the SEC. The safe harbor proposal that Commissioner Peirce put forward is very reasonable. It would solve a lot of the information transparency concerns of the SEC. It would protect investors. It would ultimately not stifle innovation. And it would give us a chance to truly understand how some of these decentralized organizations should be able to report as a community, since they're not companies and they don't even necessarily have the ability to disclose as a first party. That has been just left for dead. And Commissioner Peirce and her staff has gone through multiple iterations of this. There is no sign that this is going to be picked up in any way, shape, or form. And that is something that the SEC could pick up if they wanted to. They choose not to, and instead they're choosing to enforce, to subpoena, and essentially bully entrepreneurs and builders within the ecosystem versus engage and solve the underlying problem, which is information asymmetry.
Right, but you've identified how much of changes you want to see, but for that change to happen, we need our lawmakers to change.
That's correct.
You know, I'm not just venting and it's fun talk politics. I mean, for real. And a recent Senate hearing, I think it was Senator Portman, crypto opponent, did say he doesn't like crypto, but he's like he'd never seen anything like it. The reaction during the infrastructure debate, which I think you helped kind of lead the charge on Twitter, and crypto is suddenly calling their senators, doing things like that. I mean, what is the next step? Do you have sort of a hope that the crypto industry can become a political force like the oil lobby, like the entertainment lobby, like everything else, like the banks who are probably helping whispering in Senator Portman's ear? So what's the next step there? Are you hopeful, or how do you feel?
Well, I heard a good line from someone the other day. I won't name him by name, but he called crypto pre-political and talked about the rarity of the environment that we're in right now, where crypto, pro and con crypto, has not yet been overtly politicized. And it's not a red versus blue issue.
Right.
This was a very bipartisan initiative in DC around the infrastructure bill. We would have gotten there were it not for one retiring 87-year-old senator from Alabama who was 80% funded by the banks historically and trying to get his staffers cushy Wall Street jobs. Maybe, probably. But if you think about that moment that we had, and the fact that you had a 21-year-old Brown graduate write an open letter to Senator Warren that was exceptionally well written, making the progressive case for Bitcoin. And then you had, about as far as I can think on the other side, Ted Cruz standing up
some GOP
and talking about the importance to lighten up on the regulation of a technology that, frankly, the Senate, the congressional staffers just do not understand. I think it was a rare and special moment and a little bit of an opening. Now the question is, are we going to be able to move fast enough as an industry, and are we going to be able to have some alignment on what's a decentralized ecosystem with a lot of different competing factions to put together some type of common, straightforward frameworks that will ultimately get us what we want without just giving the finger to the regulatory state? Because I don't think anyone in this room, I mean, you've walked the floors, I don't think anyone in this room is a cypherpunk or radical libertarian. I mean, we're not in 2013 anymore. I think there's a lot of reasonable people here, but it's tough to be reasonable when someone looks at you and says, I don't think your company should exist.
I haven't seen the Fuck the Fed t-shirts that I saw in Miami. So, different feel there.
Well, yeah, I certainly hope that we don't get that here, but look, people are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to have fun with it. We did play the Imperial March when we had Chair Gensler's image up on the screen, but it was all in good fun. I would have much more fun if he was actually engaging in good faith with some of the folks in the industry versus serving subpoenas in our escalator banks.
And Ryan, we got to ask these Senate rumors. Are you just having fun, or are we actually going to see that?
Selkis for Senate.
Well, I think the next opening would be 2024 in terms of where I'm physically located, so there's a lot of time to actually consider that. But based on the response yesterday, it could have started as something not so serious, but I think the net favorables there were probably 99-1. So we'll see.
And you know what? I hear some of these people have some money there.
If they sell.
It would be quite the catalyst for political fundraising, wouldn't it?
Nice. Well, Ryan Selkis, thanks for joining us. We've loved being your media partner at Mainnet.
Absolutely.
Cool.
It's been great working with you guys. Thank you. Take care, guys.
Nice.